The night my daughter told me I was a burden. She was sitting in a chair I built with my own hands. She didn't know that, of course. She'd never asked. The rocking chair in the corner of my living room, the one she was sitting in while she scrolled her phone and waited for me to finish making her coffee, I'd carved it from a red oak I felled on this property 31 years ago, the summer after her mother and I first moved in. I'd sanded every joint by hand. I'd stained it twice. I'd given it to Margaret as a wedding anniversary gift, and after Margaret died, I'd moved it to the living room because I couldn't stand seeing it empty in the bedroom. My daughter, Renee, didn't know any of that. She just sat in it and told me I was a burden. I want to be precise about what she said, because I've replayed it enough times that I've committed it to memory the way you commit a scar. Not because you want to, but because it's there every time you look. She said, "Dad, I'm going to be honest with you because I love you. You need more help than any of us can realistically provide. The house is too much. The property is too much. You're 71 years old and you call Marcus twice a week with problems that any assisted living facility would just handle automatically. It's become a burden. You've become a burden. I don't know how else to say it." I remember I didn't respond right away. I set her coffee down on the end table, the one I'd also built, though she didn't know that either, and I walked to the window and I looked out at the 42 acres that had been in my family for 3 generations. Then I said, "I appreciate your honesty." And I meant it, not the way people mean it when they're being polite. I meant it the way you mean it when someone has just, without knowing it, handed you exactly the information you needed. Let me tell you who I am before I tell you what I did. My name is Daniel Hargrove. I spent 34 years as a structural engineer before I retired. I designed bridges, not the glamorous suspension kind you see on postcards, the unglamorous, essential kind that carry freight in school buses and ambulances across rivers that nobody photographs. I was good at my work because I understood load-bearing. I understood that the difference between a structure that holds and one that fails is almost always invisible from the outside. It lives in the joints, in what you can't see. Margaret and I raised 2 children on this property. Renee, who was sitting in Margaret's rocking chair telling me I was a burden, and our son Marcus, who called me twice a week, apparently an inconvenience to check in. Marcus was 43. He ran a landscaping company in the next county. He hadn't married. He drove a truck with 190,000 miles on it and never complained about it. He called me on Tuesdays and Thursdays without fail, and the calls were never about anything urgent. He called because he wanted to talk to his father. Renee was 46. She'd married well. Her husband, Greg, was a partner at a commercial real estate firm in the city. They had a house with 4 bathrooms and a kitchen that had been professionally photographed for a home design website. Their 2 children attended private school. Renee managed their household and their social calendar, and apparently her opinion of her father. I had never, in my 71 years, considered myself a burden to anyone. Margaret would have laughed at the suggestion. But Renee had said what she said, and now I had information. The following Monday morning, I called my attorney, a man named Howard Bellows who I'd known for 22 years. I told him I wanted to revisit my estate plan. He asked if everything was all right. I told him everything was fine. I just wanted to make some adjustments. Howard was a careful man. He didn't ask questions he didn't need to ask. He scheduled me for Wednesday afternoon. My estate at the time of that meeting was structured as most estates are when one spouse has already passed. Margaret and I had prepared matching wills years earlier. The property, the house and the 42 acres, was to be divided equally between Renee and Marcus upon my death. Additionally, I had a brokerage account and a pension that, combined, represented a meaningful sum. Those assets had also been split evenly. I sat across from Howard, and I told him what I wanted to change. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment, then he said, "Daniel, I want to make sure I understand this correctly. You do, I said. You want to place the property into a revocable living trust, with Marcus as the sole beneficiary of the real estate. Yes. And you want to restructure the financial accounts so that Marcus receives 70% of the liquid assets and Renee receives 30%. Yes. And you want to include, as part of the trust documentation, a letter of instruction that explains your reasoning. Yes. I want it clearly stated that this is not the result of any cognitive impairment, any coercion, or any family conflict I'm unaware of. I am making these decisions with full clarity and of my own free will, for reasons I've outlined in the letter. Howard looked at me over his reading glasses. The letter is going to matter, Daniel, when Renee sees this. I know, I said. That's why I want it in writing. I want to be clear about something. I was not doing this out of spite. Spite is a small emotion. It curdles and it sours and it poisons the person holding it more than anyone else. Margaret had no tolerance for spite. She would have wanted me to examine my motives carefully, and I did. What I was doing was something different. I was responding to information. Renee had told me, plainly and directly, that my presence in her life had become a logistical problem. She had not said this in anger. She had not said it during an argument. She had said it calmly, with what she believed was love, in the considered tone of someone who had thought it through. That meant she believed it. That meant it was her true assessment. And if I was a burden to her, if my phone calls to her brother were an imposition, if my continued presence on this land was an inconvenience, then I had no business leaving her a substantial share of that land. I wasn't punishing her. I was simply listening to what she'd told me and adjusting accordingly. Marcus knew nothing about any of this. I didn't tell him what Renee had said. I didn't tell him about the meeting with Howard. He called on Tuesday and we talked about a job he'd bid on and about the deer that had been getting into his garden beds, and I didn't say a word about any of it. Some things a father carries alone. The changes took about 6 weeks to finalize. Howard was thorough. He always was, and he wanted to make sure the trust documents were airtight and the letter of instruction was properly witnessed and notarized. By the time everything was signed, it was late October. The oak trees on the property were the color of old rust, and the air had that particular sharpness that I've always associated with the end of things that need ending. I felt, for the first time since Margaret died, that I had done something she would have respected. Renee came for Thanksgiving. She came every year, and I had not told her anything, and I did not behave any differently than I had before. I made the turkey the way I'd made it for 40 years. I made Margaret's cornbread dressing from the recipe card that still had Margaret's handwriting on it. I sat at the head of the table I'd built, yes, that too, and I listened to my grandchildren argue about something on their phones, and I watched Renee refill her wine glass and laugh at something Greg said, and I thought, she has no idea. Not because I was planning to surprise her, but because she had already moved me out of the category of people whose lives she paid close attention to. I was infrastructure. I was background. I was, as she'd said, a burden, which meant I was something to be managed, not observed. If she had been watching, she would have noticed that I seemed lighter, that I'd started taking longer walks in the morning, that I'd begun repairing the fence along the south pasture, not because I had to, but because I wanted to, because this land was going to be Marcus's someday, and I wanted to hand it to him in good condition. The way you hand things to people you respect. She didn't notice any of it. The document arrived in both their hands via certified mail in early December. Howard had suggested I be present when they received it, in case questions arose. I declined. I told him I would be available by phone. Marcus called me within an hour of receiving his copy. His voice was careful. "Dad, I need to understand what I'm reading." "You're reading correctly," I said. "This is the property, the whole thing. And 70% of the liquid assets. Yes. There was a long silence. Dad, I don't. Why? Because you've spent the last 3 years calling me twice a week to make sure I'm all right, I said. Because you've driven out here 14 times since your mother died to help me with things I could have hired out. Because last February when the pipes froze, you came at 11 o'clock at night and you stayed until 2 in the morning. And when I tried to pay you for your time, you looked at me like I'd said something in a foreign language. I paused. Because you have never, not once, made me feel like a burden. Another silence. I should also tell you, I said, that Renee is going to be very upset. Yeah, Marcus said quietly. I imagine she is. Renee called that evening. I had expected her to call that evening. She did not use the calm, considered tone she'd used in my living room 3 months earlier. She was not, in that moment, delivering a thoughtful assessment. She was angry, genuinely, nakedly angry, and I understood that the anger was partly grief, because underneath the entitlement and the careful management of her feelings, she was a woman who had lost her mother and was now discovering that she had miscalculated the significance of her father. I let her speak. I did not interrupt. When she had finished, I said, Renee, do you remember what you said to me in September when you were sitting in your mother's rocking chair? Silence. You told me I'd become a burden. You said you didn't know how else to say it. I appreciated that honesty. I still do. I took what you said seriously and I made decisions based on it. Dad, that's not, I didn't mean. I know what you meant, I said. I'm not angry with you. I want you to hear that clearly. I'm not doing this to punish you. I'm doing this because you told me something true about how you see me and I adjusted accordingly. This is not a punishment. This is me listening. She was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke again, her voice was different, smaller. What do I have to do to change this? Nothing, I said. I'm not asking you to prove anything to me. I'm not holding this over you as leverage. The documents are signed. They reflect my wishes. I paused. What I would ask, not for the will but for us, is that you think about what you said that day. Not because I want an apology, but because I think you said something you believed and I think you deserve to sit with the consequences of believing it. Not the legal consequences, the other kind. I've thought since then about what it means to be seen. Renee came back at Christmas. She was quieter than usual. She sat in her mother's rocking chair again, but this time she ran her hand along the arm the way you touch something you've suddenly noticed. She asked me at one point if I'd made it. I told her I had. She didn't say anything for a while. Then she said, I didn't know that. There's a lot you didn't know, I said. Not your fault, you weren't looking. We are, I think, in the early stages of something different between us. I don't know what to call it yet. It doesn't feel like reconciliation, exactly. It feels more like introduction. Like we're beginning to meet each other. At 71 and 46, which is either very late or exactly on time, depending on how you look at it. Marcus came out 2 weekends ago and we finished the south fence together. It took us all of Saturday and most of Sunday morning. We didn't talk constantly. That's not how Marcus and I are with each other. We worked, and occasionally one of us would say something, and the other would respond, and then we'd go back to working. At one point, in the late afternoon when the light was coming through the oaks at that particular angle, Marcus set down his post-pounder and looked out over the property and said, This is a good piece of land, Dad. It is, I said. I'll take care of it. I know you will. He picked up the post-pounder. We went back to work. I think about Margaret in those moments. I think about the rocking chair and the end table and the dining room table and the fences and the 42 acres and the 34 years of bridges that still stand over rivers all across this state. I think about what it means to build things that hold. Renee called me last Tuesday, not about anything urgent, just to talk. I noticed that she called on a Tuesday, the same day Marcus calls. I don't know if she knows that. I don't know if it matters. But I answered, and we talked for an hour, and at the end, before she hung up, she said, I love you, Dad. And I said, I know, Renee, I love you too. Because I do, I have always loved her. That was never the question. The question was whether love, the real kind, the kind that sees you clearly and keeps showing up anyway, is something you assume or something you earn. She's learning the answer now. We both are.